Welcome back to another presidential video here on Stuff That Happened, and today I'll be talking about 5 presidents I consider to be the most underrated when looking at official surveys and rankings, along with the general consensus opinion I hear from others. These videos serve not just to give a personal opinion, which is just that, an opinion, but also and mostly to learn some things about the presidents and hopefully stir up some interesting and meaningful conversations in the comments section. Before getting into my top 5, I do need to mention the current president, Donald J. Trump, because I know that many people in the comments section will wonder why he's not on the list. Trump is consistently ranked as one of, if not the worst president in United States history. And let's be honest, this is a clear case of extreme recency bias from largely left-wing academic institutions. And had President Trump not run for a second term, he would have been considered for today's list. However, since he is the current president and hasn't finished his 2 terms, I'll wait until he completes his second term before officially putting him in any ranking, since he's still the current president and who knows what could happen in the next 3+ years that could change the way he would be ranked as a U.S. president. So now let's get into my top 5 underrated U.S. presidents. Number 5, James K. Polk. Polk has absolutely tanked in recent years in the surveys, falling all the way to number 25 in 2024. This has to be due to him being a slave owner and the disciple of the racist Andrew Jackson. Polk was even called Young Hickory to compliment Jackson's nickname Old Hickory. But as president, he was one of the most effective and efficient in the history of the United States. No one can say he didn't keep his campaign promises. In fact, he laid out his plan beforehand, highlighting 4 goals: reestablishing the independent treasury system, reducing tariffs, negotiating Oregon country with England, and pushing the U.S. further westward by acquiring California and New Mexico. Americans were skeptical that he could accomplish all 4 goals in one term, but that's exactly what Polk did. The treasury system was quickly reestablished. Polk fought hard to get the Walker tariff enacted, reducing tariffs to one of the lowest in history. Then there's the negotiation for Oregon country, which wasn't as quick and smooth and almost led to an all-out war with Britain. But at the end, an agreement was reached and the dividing line was placed along the 49th parallel. This led to the states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. The final goal did lead to war. Mexico stood in Polk's way of westward expansion. They owed the U.S. a debt of $4.5 million that was never repaid. Polk offered to cancel the debt if they would sell California and New Mexico for $25 million, but Mexico refused. Polk then sent troops to Texas to try and settle a dispute over territorial boundaries near the Rio Grande, which provoked Mexican troops to defend what they considered their land. American soldiers were killed in the conflict, and Congress declared war. The U.S. eventually won the Mexican-American War, and under Polk, the shape of the U.S. as we know it was essentially formed. However, critics say that he rushed into the war, which caused the deaths of over 50,000 people, but he did achieve every one of his goals and did not even bother running for a second term, explaining that he had already accomplished everything he set out to do. Polk may not be an all-time great president, and he was a ruthless proponent of manifest destiny, but Mexico did default on their debt and did fire the first shots. Once U.S. soldiers were killed, Polk did have a reason to convince Congress to declare war. But based on where I see Polk in most of the rankings, and based on the fact that most people have never even heard of him, I'd have to say he is definitely underrated. Number 4, John Adams. Coming in at number 4 is John Adams, who doesn't rank particularly bad in most surveys, usually landing in the teens, between about 13 and 19. However, out of 20 surveys since 1990, only 1 has him in the top 10.
And I have no stomach for, sir. Mr. Adams. No stomach at all.
John Adams was, of course, one of the founding fathers of the United States and co-author of the Declaration of Independence. But how was he as president? Adams had to follow the beloved first president, George Washington, and this was no easy task. Division between political parties, mudslinging, hatred from the opposition no matter what you do, basically what politics is today, began mostly during Adams' term. But through all of that, he was more than competent. There were no scandals or corruption during Adams' term, and if we criticize early presidents for owning slaves, we have to also praise John Adams as the only one of the first 5 presidents to never own a single slave. Adams considered the practice of slavery abhorrent, but his main accomplishment was strengthening the U.S. military while avoiding a full-scale war with France. Back during the Revolutionary War, France supported the U.S., and in return, the U.S. agreed to protect the West French Indies in the 1778 Treaty of Alliance, which had no termination date. For this reason, France expected the U.S. to support them during the French Revolution as they fought against Great Britain. But with the execution of Louis XVI and the new French Republic in place, the US claimed that any of those old agreements with the previous government were now void. Furthermore, the Jay Treaty was signed during Washington's term, restoring relations between the US and Great Britain, further angering France. So French ships began to seize American ships that attempted to trade with the British. 316 U.S. ships were captured, causing millions of dollars in losses. Adams could have declared war, but instead worked towards a peaceful resolution while building up and preparing the military. He sent a peace commission to France to discuss the matter, but the French refused the meeting and sent 3 agents, referred to by Adams only as Agents X, Y, and Z, to demand a $12 million bribe from the U.S. and a new treaty. They had completely insulted the U.S., and Adams was now under immense pressure to declare war. He continued to resist. An undeclared naval war did begin anyway, and Adams appointed the first Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Stoddert. He also built up the Navy and increased the manpower of the Army. Both Adams and the new head of the French government, Napoleon, wanted the pointless naval conflict to end, and the Convention of 1800 was signed, which confirmed the United States' right to neutrality in European affairs. The captured ships were returned, and the Treaty of Alliance was officially terminated. Although many of Adams' decisions during this conflict were and continue to be criticized, he avoided a full-scale war with France, a war he had every opportunity to declare. It could have been absolutely devastating for the young and fragile nation. But Adams is held back in the rankings due to the unpopular signing of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which enabled the president to deport immigrants considered a threat and restricted free speech against the government. These acts were completely unconstitutional, but the country was in its first major crisis at the time, with war looming and political dissent at an all-time high. Adams felt it was necessary to avoid riots or even a complete revolution. These acts were a mistake and a black eye on his presidency, but Adams still saved the country from a potentially disastrous war and sacrificed his own potential legacy by pushing for peace. He also established the Library of Congress, and when he became the first sitting president to lose an election, he handled the transition of power perfectly. So for me, John Adams continues to be mostly underrated. Number 3, Calvin Coolidge. Based on every official survey done since he left office, Calvin Coolidge appears to be a very below average at best president. He has recently been ranked at number 34 and number 32, dangerously close to the bottom 10. Although Coolidge certainly wasn't a perfect president, he had a rare personality for someone who made it all the way to the presidency. He was humble and quiet, and did not bring a massive ego to the White House with him. He was called Silent Cal for his unassuming demeanor and dry sense of humor. However, despite being a man of few words, he was a skilled public speaker, a talent important for any politician. Coolidge was the vice president during the corrupt administration of Warren G. Harding and took over as president when Harding suddenly passed away in 1923. He handled the problems of the previous administration swiftly, cleaning up the corruption while ensuring those who committed crimes from within Harding's circle were arrested but also given due process and a fair trial. Coolidge won the election of 1924, and the U.S. entered into a period of prosperity known as the Roaring Twenties. The economy was very strong during Coolidge's time as president, although some of his actions have been blamed for the Great Depression that would hit after he left office. He was one of the few presidents of the first half of the 20th century to speak out against racial injustice. He stated in his first State of the Union address that the rights of African Americans were just as sacred as those of any other citizen. He repeatedly tried to make lynching a federal crime, but Congress refused to pass the legislation. Still, his calls for enforcement of state laws that did exist caused a major decrease in the amount of lynchings, and he took measures to eliminate the KKK, and they lost millions of members. Coolidge also signed the Indian Citizenship Act, granting U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans living in the United States, including those on reservations. He took an active role in trying to improve the lives of Americans, although some say he could have done more, but compared to most other presidents during his time, Coolidge was one of the best, regarding civil rights. He dealt with conflicts with Latin American countries, frustrated with the constant presence and influence the U.S. held in their territory. Leaders from these countries planned to meet for a conference in Cuba, and Coolidge decided to make the trip as well, meeting face to face with these leaders in order to extend an olive branch. The meeting went well, and war was avoided, a key objective for Coolidge. He even signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, a peacekeeping initiative that renounced war as a means of solving conflicts. It was signed by a total of 14 countries, and although it was mostly symbolic, it was an important step in the right direction towards creating a world in which killing each other cannot be a way countries officially solve their disputes. Obviously, the pact wasn't too effective as World War II would kick off in the 40s, but at least Coolidge was taking measures to try and avoid war at all costs. The tax breaks to big corporations and deregulation policies of Coolidge are oftentimes cited as factors in the eventual Great Depression, and I won't argue that, but he was certainly not the only leader whose actions led to Black Thursday. Overall, Coolidge was a strong but quiet leader who was not egotistical, avoided wars, pushed for civil rights, and did lead America through one of its most prosperous and exciting times. He might not be a top 10 president, but he is extremely underrated. Number 2, Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland's place on presidential rankings seemed to have only gotten worse over the years, and he has recently been ranked as low as number 26. I find this absolutely incomprehensible and can only be attributed to his second term, which admittedly was defined by a serious financial panic. But that aside, Cleveland was a rare, honest politician who worked day and night to accomplish his goals, and one of the primary ones was getting rid of corruption. He worked up from a local sheriff to mayor, to governor, and finally to the 22nd President of the United States. Cleveland vetoed any bill in which he smelt the slightest whiff of corruption and ended up vetoing more bills than any other president. He nullified fraudulent grants, rejected corrupt measures, and became extremely popular amongst the everyday people whose lives were improving under Cleveland. He took measures to help Native Americans, and although not all his policies worked, the intent was always to help them. He also enacted the Interstate Commerce Commission, regulating railroads and eliminating rate discrimination, keeping rates fair for everybody traveling by railroad or bus. Cleveland wasn't overly ambitious regarding foreign affairs and squashed treaties and proposals that would have expanded U.S. interest in other territories because he felt war and needless deaths could have been the result. When he did have to involve himself in foreign affairs, he moved with tact and caution, such as when he negotiated a treaty with Great Britain over fishing rights off the coast of Alaska. Cleveland avoided wars, but still made sure the military was strong, capable, and utilized the most modern technology. He lost his re-election campaign but came back after one term of Benjamin Harrison. And yes, like I said, his second term is remembered for a panic, and also for a violent railroad strike which forced Cleveland to issue an injunction ensuring federal mail could be delivered. Although crushing the strike was unpopular, Cleveland had no choice, and even during his less successful second term, he continued to fight corruption and do whatever he could for the people, working tirelessly to be the best leader he could be. Cleveland is a top president for me, and certainly extremely underrated. Number 1, Ulysses S Grant. But coming in at number 1 is Ulysses S Grant, not one of my top 5 presidents of all time. But when you see how low he's been ranked in most of these surveys, even considering a recent bump, he is my most underrated ever. Grant is perhaps known as the Civil War general who turned around the war in favor of the North and met with General Lee to negotiate the South's surrender. But he was also a great president and one of the only ones during the 19th century who took serious measures in promoting racial harmony and equal rights, working to pass the 15th Amendment, which allowed all Americans, including former slaves, to vote. He tried his utmost to get citizens to follow civil rights laws by passing enforcement acts. He successfully eliminated the Ku Klux Klan, and they did not emerge again until after Grant's death. Grant appointed an actual Native American, Eli S. Parker, as the commission of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He focused hard on helping both African Americans and Native Americans, although not all his policies worked. But that was more due to the racism prominent in the country and not Grant's efforts. If every president were as dedicated as he was to civil rights, it would not have taken over 100 years since Lincoln to finally pass effective legislation. Grant was an honest politician who restored stability to a country completely completely torn apart from the Civil War. He worked well with others and set his ego aside, understanding that he was not an expert in all matters. Sometimes he did take his trust too far, which led to scandals, but most historians agree Grant was innocent and taken advantage of. He did have some other failures with foreign affairs and appointed some questionable men to key positions, but his successes outweigh his failures, and he should be nowhere near the bottom of the list, as I oftentimes see his name in presidential rankings. And this has given him a reputation among many history buffs as a great general but horrible president. And I completely disagree. As a general, he was elite. As a president, he was well above average. For a complete video of Grant and my analysis of his presidency and why I feel he's the most underrated ever, check out the video linked above. Thanks so much for checking out today's video on my top 5 most underrated presidents. Be sure to leave a comment down below with your thoughts, and we'll talk to you all in the next video.